Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the fourth conversation in the series of conversations that we've been having over this two-day webinar. This afternoon's conversation involves three extraordinary scholars, Antonia Carcelen, Babli Moitra Saraf, and Vicente Rafael. Just a quick word, Vicente had a few problems. I was about to say that Vicente was going to be a little bit late because we had problems actually getting him to link his video to the webinar, but here he is. So as not to take up too much time, because really we don't have all that much for a very fascinating, what's going to be a very fascinating conversation, I'll just very quickly introduce the three speakers in rigorously alphabetical order. First of all, Antonia Carcelen teaches oral literature and intercultural translation at USFQ in Ecuador and is currently a British Academy Research Fellow at Northumbria University in the UK. Her decolonial research connects early modern transatlantic literature and historiography, translation studies, and today's intercultural conflicts with an emphasis on cultural politics and performance. As an interdisciplinary scholar and translator, she connects people and ideas across disciplines and borders, among them Islamic, Afro-descendant, Jewish, and indigenous histories, to better articulate a decolonial resistance to current oppressive regimes. She has published her work with the University of Massachusetts Press, Palgrave, Routledge, as well as with journals such as Translation, Translation Studies, and New Diversities. Her latest publications include studies on medieval intercultural literary practices with Viator and issues of historiography, indigeneity, and memory with Disability Studies Quarterly, as well as reflections on decolonizing oral history with the History Journal in the UK. Her work with Black feminists in the Great Chocó will be featured in Radical History Review and the European Journal of Politics and Gender. Her manuscript, Cervantes and Islam, is currently being prepared for UPenn University Press, Golden Palimpsests for Afrozona University Press, and Sumac Corset Under Siege for Duke University Press. Babli Moitra Saraf, who hardly needs an introduction, is the principal of Indraprastha College for Women, University of Delhi. She holds a Master of Philosophy in English and a PhD in Sociology. She has been a scholar under the Indo-Italian Cultural Exchange Program, a research associate at the NIDA School of Translation Studies, Misano, Italy, and visiting faculty at NSTS. Her ongoing research examines traditions of orality, embodied languages, and performance. She serves on the editorial board of Sa Sansar New Delhi and is a member of the scientific board of In Other Words, Worlds project book series on translations from Asia and North Africa, Department of Asian and North African Studies, Ca' Foscari University, Italy. She translates from Indian languages as well as from Italian into English and Hindi. She has edited and published selected Hindi short stories for the Sahitya Academy in India and has translated Mahasweta Devi's work from Bengali into Italian in collaboration with Maria Federica Oddera. Her work, Rajuri Remembered, is a translation of a family narrative from Hindi, Urdu, Punjabi, and oral history. She has co-edited with Shomishta Panja, Performing Shakespeare in Italy, Exploring Indianness, Literatures and Cultures. Her publication, Hey Diddle Diddle, Tun Tun Tara Tara, contains Hindi adaptations of popular English nursery rhymes. Last but not least, Vicente Rafael is Professor of History and Southeast Asian Studies at the University of Washington in Seattle. He has written extensively on a wide range of topics, focusing on areas such as language and power, the politics of translation and literature, comparative colonialisms and nationalisms, the social history of media and mediation, critical theory and anthropology, empire, race and gender. Rafael's books include Contracting Colonialism, Translation and Christian Conversion in Tagalog Society under Early Spanish Rule, White Love and Other Events in Filipino History, The Promise of the Foreign, Nationalism and the Techniques of Translation in the Spanish Philippines, Motherless Tongues, The Insurgency of Language Amid Wars of Translation, and the forthcoming The Sovereign Trickster, Death and Laughter in the Age of Duterte, all published by Duke University Press. He has also published numerous essays in such journals as The Translator, Public Culture, Positions, Asian Culture Critique, the Journal of Asian Studies, American Historical Review, Social Text, Philippine Studies, and other venues. The introduction was a lot longer than I'd expected, but there are three wonderful conversationalists who are about to start. So I would ask whoever it is starting to please begin. Thank you. Please make sure to turn your microphones on.
Okay, yeah. Can you hear me now?
Perfect.
Hello everyone. Thank you, Salvatore. And Vicente, like you said, and Antonia, I can't see Antonia. She must be here.
I'm here.
Oh, excellent. Hi.
Hi.
We couldn't get to speak when I spoke last time with Vicente, but we decided that given the time that we have, 45 minutes, he requested me to go first. So I will. And actually, I have several reference points, and the perfect entry point was, of course, the previous conversation of Christy and Bella and Julia, I think, student's name, about audiobooks. So besides which, there are several reference points which become really milestones in the way that I have considered this, what I have to say here, including conversations on the center and on the journal in our previous meetings. And I would be bringing in some of those. Of course, translation is life. This session is titled Translation is Life, Communicative Struggles in the Global South. And the title of this conversation has at least two parts and many layers besides. The two parts, translating life and communicative struggle, may also seem to be in opposition. For if translation is life, why are we talking about communicative struggles? And that's where I want to bring in also further delimiting the global South, as the Eurocentric mapping of North-South is done in this title itself, precludes the possibility and consideration of conversations or communication between South-South, as we know existed, and now Indian Ocean studies are bringing those into the forefront, the South-South dialogue, conversation, communication, translation. And also North-North, if you think of the conversation yesterday with Professor Bayer, where Europe stopped at the Iron Curtain or the Berlin Wall, whatever you may choose. Going westwards from the metropolitan centers, Hawaii has presented a problem to me as a visitor in thinking of it being part of the USA. Those are perhaps beyond the scope of today's conversation, but I wish to introduce them to stimulate and provoke thought, particularly among young scholars of translation studies who are part of this colloquium. Time being short, I would prefer to write down what I have to say, and you will excuse that perhaps when we can talk more expansively when we go on to the discussion, if there is any. I also recall Brian's question yesterday, how rigidly do we define theory and how rigorously apply, given the huge gaps in knowledge and historical erasures? Pre-colonial India, for instance, saw massive contact with different peoples. The internal movements across regions always made translation an imperative, albeit a non-reflective one. Look, I'm located in New Delhi, India, and I think location is important because the title itself points towards location as a kind of defining character. It was a given of the situation of multilinguality, which is what the region is really about, many languages, of trade and seafaring people, also in a region with a long coastline, as well as along landlocked frontiers. Translations were undertaken of various documents and texts across history by foreigners, and engagement with local vernaculars and official languages developed their own trajectories. India has always been home to traders, travelers, settlers, and invaders. These moments in its regional history have been very important for language and culture. And Christy is here, and she is she is really the most knowledgeable about Hindi, Urdu, which developed as a camp language to communicate during the period of incursion from Northwest into India, as far back as in the 11th, 12th centuries. It has since developed, Urdu has since developed into a prominent and important language of India, using the Persian script and a mixture of vocabulary from Persian, Arabic, Hindi, and other languages of the Indo-Gangetic plain mainly. In Bengal, after the Turkish invasion in 1205 and the throning of the Turks, Persian remained the court and the official language for 500 years. And it was the language of the elites, and it occupied this, the kind of link language status that English did and also does now. So these are things that need to be explored and studied when we talk about the language situation or communicative struggles in the global South. Translation from regional languages into other regional Indian languages is an activity formally undertaken in the decades after independence of India in 1947. In India, there is a huge engagement with its own languages, and these are also part of this communicative struggle. Translation, both as a concept and as a practice, is embedded in a South-South conversation and relationship, as well as in an intra-South conversation as in the subcontinent, in the Indian subcontinent, where the nascent nation state is organized along largely linguistic regional groupings. These continue to date. Now, I would like to introduce some ideas foundational to the first part of the topic here, translation is life, and conclude with a picture of a continuing communicative struggle in the global South, namely here in India, South Asia, located as in other parts of the world in the history of colonization also. Now, my first point is that the Eurocentric view of translation and translation studies thinks monolingual countries, communities, and languages as verbalized words, scripted and in terms of original texts. In many regions, including those of the global South and South Asia, societies and countries are multilingual, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, and so on. In these variegated societies, translation is a continual process, understood as a metaphor, or in Sherry Simon's words in one of our discussions, thinking translationally on other things. It involves thinking translationally on other things because the specificities of identities are negotiated with fellow beings voluntarily as well as out of necessity in terms of the language of trade, of commerce, of marriage, love, and on other social platforms of interaction, including that of conflict, war. Translation is thus here an act of accommodation in an encounter and an encounter, the ability to transform in order to be participative in a given society or a region, and not just about finding equivalences, substitutions, and representations. Academic engagement with translation is thus also about developing a new vocabulary to include this in the framework of scholarship. Of course, correspondences, equivalences, substitutions, these things happen in the language of music perfectly in the Indian rag, tal system, especially can be heard in jugalbandis, for instance, when the tabla and the sitar are playing and they're talking to each other in perfect melodic cycles without exact correspondence. That's something I wanted to also indicate. The second thing I want to, or rather continual with this, is also that language is also performative and robust oral traditions. This is something that Christy said. Languages without scripts coexist with an erudite written tradition. These flourish alongside visual languages of art, architecture, motifs, and other unaccounted, intangible modes, such as religious practices, modes of worship, belief, and faith in this business of translating life. Here, for paucity of time, I will offer two examples. One from a Hindu religious text. It's a sections of the liturgical language Sanskrit. It's from the Durga Saptashati, which is the invocation of the goddess Durga in her 9 forms. And it's seemingly, it's inscribed in a series of phonemes. The invocation of the deity herself is envisioned as in mantras, probably arcane. Maybe there may be some, there are meanings, I'm sure, which I have not been able to uncover or discover. But I would like to just emphasize the fact here that the concatenation of sounds joined to form the deity, give the deity a form. So she's called Mantra Rupini, Rup meaning form. So Mantra Rupini, the deity who takes the form of the mantra itself. And this is very interesting because, I came across this when I was just reading the Saptashati for various reasons. And I just want to demonstrate one line. It says, Vichya Jabheda Nityam Namaste Mantra Rupini. And then kam cham tam tam pam yam sham vim dum in bim hak hang sham dijagaram trote trote. These are sounds as far as we are concerned, and they are there in this this part of the text, which is called Siddhi Kunjika Stotram, which is the essence, the realization of the entire text here in this invocation of the form through a series of sounds. Orality is important, not just because of this, creating this, what we called in one of our discussions, a soundscape, but also because there is merit in listening. Merit is given to the listener. The poet after poet, including from the Mahabharata itself and its various narrations, say that Mahabharatir Katha Amrita Shaman, the words of Mahabharata are like ambrosia. The poet Kashiram Das, that's the Bengali version, Kashiram Das recites, and the earner of merit listens. So in listening, there is merit earned. So this is an important concept of the listener, the reception of a text, or an oral text, which is not just orality language or an oral language, but also there is merit in listening to it. And so this also connects perfectly with what we've heard, just in the previous conversation. So my second example regarding, how we are to regard the business of translation and look at translational ways of thinking refers to translation choices, which may give different worldviews on life and raise questions of whether being is constituted by identity, which is the dominant form of thinking about identity and being in the Eurocentric tradition, or translation as becoming, which is an engagement with fluidity of identity of the other, not just as human beings, but also the non-human animals, elements, and inanimate objects, and that through communication and translation acquire personhood and life. Translation thus becomes less about construction of meaning, but rather an engagement with difference that converts one kind of life into another. In the famous Hermann Hesse work, Siddhartha, 1922, it's his German work, made into a film by Konrad Rux in 1972-73 in English. The river in the film is life itself, echoing a popular Bengali song in a refrain throughout, O Nodire, O river. And the river becomes a person, therefore, in the film, and moves accordingly. Now, as I said, that the Persian as the language of the elites remain the court language in Bengal, and colonialism, so it was so much of a linked language that in the 17th century, we have the texts of the Marathas rulers communicating with their Rajasthani counterpart in Farsi. Farsi is Persian. Now, colonialism and its rule of the British Crown for 200 years takes South Asia into another direction. The imperatives of colonial rule, and this is familiar with all these students of post-colonial studies, the imperatives of colonial rule and administration co-opting the local population is a familiar story with almost predictable outcomes and in destruction of local economies, undermining of local cultures and religions and languages through publicly proclaimed acts and decrees and policies of shaming. The real violence that is done in this process of colonization of the mind and colonization through language is and culture, in positing a superior culture of the imperialists, is this act of shaming. The simultaneous valorization we find in India of only Sanskrit and Persian as the repositories of India's wisdom, worth knowing and therefore translating for Europeans, and eventually undermining the scholarship and teaching of even those by strangulating the funds for their development and professional practice. The rich vernaculars of the region become only monographs by individual foreigners, which did nothing to further British interests in India and thus were largely ignored. Now, the story of the rise of English, the birth of English literature, these are, things that I think that we can assume that this audience knows. In any case, it's a different story and it's a story worth telling at another time. In the dismantling of colonial structures also, there was a huge violence, as we know, the violence of the partition itself as India moved towards the nation state, or the subcontinent moved towards the nation state, with becoming the nation state with the European model as paradigm. And it has been disastrous for communication in India, both within language and the language of social coexistence and co-awareness. One small example is the educational policies of the British implemented to consolidate its administration and governance, which consciously created an Anglophonic and Anglophile elite, a division that persists to the present time. So communication understood in a purely Eurocentric linguistic way may locate the communicative struggle in South Asia as one between those who have English and who do not have it, and are therefore on the margins. This struggle is addressed through some educational policies in independent India and also popular local practices of code switching and mushrooming of rapid English-speaking schools. In the period of global capital and its movement, English continues its hegemony with some degree of local assertion in fusion languages, music, and other forms of artistic expression. Largely local vernaculars stand marginalized in half-hearted assertions, unable to insert their subjects into elite social and power structures and other structures of governance. The aspiration for English has replaced and transformed the mother tongue, even in the space of the home. Languages die out every day. Revival of vernaculars envisaged through educational policies has a long struggle ahead, and practitioners of the local language will have to find not only jobs, but a scholarly framework and a global vocabulary to speak to other audiences. Until and unless others speak the same language, and in the absence of this equal, just world order or this kind of leveling in colloquia such as this one, the perception will continue to be of a global South struggling to communicate. Now, the British constructed Indian history and the canons of Indian literature. Jones's translation into English in 1789 of Kalidasa's poem Abhigyan Shakuntalam triggered its translation into 12 European languages in the next 100 years. The German translation in 1781, a French in 1803, Goethe in 1791 was influenced by it in his Faust. It became the perfect piece to showcase as an example of world literature and, of course, of classical Indian literature. But the moment these works are framed in this way, the process of exclusion is implied and insinuated. So to relocate the great Russian question in 1863 by Nikolai Chernyshevsky, what is to be done? We may well ask this question for translation and translation studies. I rest my case here.
I was just about to interrupt you. I'm
saving us, as your namesake says, Salvatore.
I hope to be saving everybody, not just the conversation. I'd like for the conversation to get back to being a bit of a conversation. That's all. I was just getting a little bit worried. I see Vicente and Antonia waiting to begin their dialogue with you, and I would like to invite them to participate as well. Okay, I'm so sorry for the interruption. Vicente, Antonia?
Yeah, I think Antonia goes first.
Yeah.
Okay, Antonia.
Okay, so we were talking about the ways to approach translation from the work that we are doing currently, right? So to think translation from our practices in the global South. And also giggling a bit about that concept of the global South, right? As a colonial concept in itself. But in terms of systems theory or whatever, there's centers and there's peripheries, but then the peripheries become centers, right? And it is very strange to me because I am working in places where 25 years ago, when, for example, I published with Maria Timosco on the Waorani in Amazon, that was, you know, such a treacherous journey. And nowadays, after the left took over and did development projects with the help of Chinese investment and to redistribute mining in the Amazon, it became a center point, not only for South America, but also the way the United States talks about the left, you know? So this is interesting because at that time, as many of you know, I was writing a paper that is, I think it's open access, the one on new diversities. And then one of the sections was about the Amazon, right? And thinking about life and while you are diagnosed with a dying disease, no? And so there's like, okay, so how do you in the midst of death think of life and reclaim life? And translation was for me a centerpiece of that transition. And so going into Ecuador to recover after surgery, knowing that I had no real access to chemotherapy because I had to join the public system. And as many of you know what that means in what you imagine the global South, it can get just as disastrous as you can think of it. And so many things happen, you know, but the important thing is that translation did keep me alive every step of the way. And so I started working through collaborations and translation projects and this is the important part. I wasn't doing an obvious translation of anything. There is no text to translate. And that's another theme of what we are engaging in these conversations, right? Is like, how do you think translationally? And all I did was bring my translational thinking into situations of activism where people were trying to talk to each other from various different places and break away from the essentialism of the who I am, right? Because even if you say, for example, I do Indian struggles or Urdu or, you know, you are taking a perspective that is still ingrained in a perspective. And the translational thinking takes you out of any monolingual perspective and put you in a space that it's another, right? And that has some echoes to what Brian was saying yesterday. Is like, if you just step out of your language, you can, but it's not just stepping out of your language, it's stepping out of you're thinking the world through that language, then rich things happen. And so I'm gonna just give you three quick examples. One is the Cimarrunas, right? The Cimarrunas is because fascism came very, very strong in the region, not only in the United States, but also in South America. Very, very strong fascist comeback. And so we started an anti-fascist and anti-racist collective. And it was interesting because in the collective, it was a lot of people from different backgrounds, including an activist from Black Lives Matter in New York who had migrated to have a safety for his Black child to Ecuador. So then you understand that things are really global no matter where you go. There were Black activists, there were critical feminists, there were geographers, there were media, a lot of media people. But then you start thinking that in Ecuador, everything happens like that. Thinking is not isolated. If you're not thinking in a collective, if you're not thinking in the relation of one collective with another collective and one struggle with another struggle, then nothing gets produced. It's really interesting because you depend on the money and the resources that are at hand, and you don't have these fancy grants that I enjoy, but then you get these little grants that come still from Germany and from France and from Great Britain, and they fund these projects on how to disseminate knowledge. And it's not the fancy journals, but it is the way people talk to each other here in this context and in these resources. So this collective publishing is also very interesting because it's not scholarly publishing. It's a lot faster, but the conversations are so rich, and they all bring that point over and over that Babli was making. Is like, where does theory come from, right? And so if it comes from the taxes, then we have to step aside as academics. That's what the activists demanded in a few encounters, such as the first feminist encounter for restorative feminist justice. That was a very interesting encounter, and activists came from all over the continent. And then you understand there's another effect happening here, and it is that there's interlinguistic translation from different contexts, from the global south, from Argentina, and also from Brazilian Portuguese and Spanish and Andean Spanish, right? And this is like a very marked circuit or flow of knowledge that I should have known it existed, but it was never obvious until I started taking this role between collectives. So another collective I work with is Mujeres de Frente, and they work with jails and survivors of prison violence, which is also connected with all kinds of global abolitionist movements. So the idea is, how to decolonize oral history, how orality can help you come to situations and use translation strategies to connect people regardless of the center. And that is the thing that I wanted to just share. I don't know if I can share screen. I'm gonna share just the next project, which is very dear to me, the Amazonian project. It took several layers. The Quijos wanted to reinvent their nation and resurrect a dead language. And so you have to do paleolinguistics and comparative linguistics with Quechua, which is the language that colonized. And what is Quechua, what is not Quechua, but what if you only can speak Quechua, right? And then it escalated into training on video, on photography, on editing, software, on how to clean audio, how to do all these strategies. And they self-produced their own, I think this is it. They self-produced their own stories. And what I wanted to get at here is archive, right? And we are thinking about audiobooks and podcasts and what is the role of the printed book. And we are understanding that the printed book is passé. We are in a different place now. And I teach my students to produce in this new place and play with the formats, because we don't know what a book will look like in this new format it is in the making. But what I do know is that when you study colonial literature and history and, you know, Middle Ages or Renaissance, you depend on an archive. And how people appear on the archive is very important. And in colonial archives, the appearance of the people is always already objectified, fetishized, because you're a stereotype and you can never live outside. You can perform all you want, but you can never live outside being that other, right? And so this was very interesting. Alicia Tanguil, well, it's Tanguil actually, she was part of the previous encounters, and we did an interview with her, and she didn't want to share it. She didn't think that there was any merit to it, and she was very shy on the first interview. And in this second interview, we shifted in that it wasn't a Spanish interviewer, but it was an indigenous interviewer from her own family. And she produced that video, you know, totally empowered. And all the things that these videos do for the communities is very interesting. Now, this project also made it possible so that all kinds of indigenous nations in the Amazon, even from other countries as far as Venezuela, Peru, they came together and started thinking about how together use translation. And here I'm literally meaning for life, you know, and not just life for their way of life and the forest and the hunting and the, you know, all these stereotyping ways that we have about the Amazon, but of life itself, a planetary life, the struggle for a sustainable future, and what is the role of indigenous translation in this sustainability of our life as itself. This one here, Babli was saying, no? Languages die every year, every day. And this is a language that has only one speaker. And so this is a very important document, even though it's not as exciting as many of the others visually. It is a very important document because it is the last speaker recording, occupying the archives and making sure that the presence of indigenous languages is there. This one, La Historia de la Comunidad Quilipamba, that is devastating. It was a very, very hard thing to watch. They made it into like a film. So they explored more cinematic possibilities for oral history. It's very interesting, but that is another project that I wanted to share. And finally, I'm gonna share the other element, which is how do you translate from one language to the same language when you don't speak that language. And here, I mean, it is working in Spanish and translating Spanish from a Black Pacific experience into an Andino-centric, where the other is the Quechua, right? So think of the United States, everything is black and white, and all the other falls out of that conversation. In Ecuador, it's the opposite. Everything is, it's the mestizo and the Indian, and so the Black falls out of that conversation, right? So even though, you know, there's a huge population, it's almost 10% of the population that is Afro-descendant in Ecuador, and our entire sovereignty. So that is the project here. And it is a project that is, here, let me see if I can do that. It is a project that that also does the same. It just gives the tools to the community to mobilize memory and use orality in order to produce real change in their action against violence, because colonialism, as Babli said, is violence, and it includes extractivism, it includes murders, it includes disappearances, it includes sexual violence, and it includes nature violence, right? So the ripping of the mangroves, and I don't know where it is, but anyways, that is another very interesting project that where women are going into the 7 different counties of this Black province in the border between Colombia and Ecuador, that is also one of those borderlands, right, that all of a sudden become the center, and the center not just for Ecuador and Colombia, because it is the new place where mining companies are coming and dispossessing, you know, but also because there is the Pacific has resignified with the reemergence of China, and China has changed completely the way that Latin America plays. And I'm gonna end with just an anecdote, and it is that Ecuador had a very strong protest in October 2019. And it is a protest that was totally understood differently if you were in the indigenous side or if you were in the white mestizo side watching it on TV, because it was the indigenous people that were taking the brunt from the militarized police, a militarized police that is militarized because it is one of Trump effects of militarizing police in Latin America as a policy, and with the weaponry of Israel, right? So then you have to really think of all these global connections, and how at the center of all that is the translation taking a stand to occupy spaces for tangible change for the indigenous and Black communities of the continent. And that, I think, is what I wanted to share with you. There was one last example of Black Lives Matter and the effect it had in Latin America, and the role translation played also connecting the Brazilian Black activists and Colombian Black activists with Puerto Rico, which is a colonized place, and also the Andean region. And with that, Vicente, take it.
Well, thanks to Babli and Antonia. I think in the interest of time, I will be extremely short. And I guess that is the privilege of coming last, is you don't have to say much because pretty much everything has been said.
And if I can just interrupt you before you start, you have as much time as you like, because we've decided to dedicate some of the question time to your own presentation, Vicente. So feel free to take as much time as you like.
Well, I think I still go on the short side, because
okay.
I would be very curious to hear what other people have to say, and
okay.
eager to plunge into the question and answer.
Perfect.
Section. I plead guilty to coming up with this title, Translation is Life. And it's because I've always had this interest in questions of translation that try to go around or go beyond or come short of the question of translation as a profession, as a vocation, as something that one does sort of secondarily. And so I've always been interested in the question of translation as primary, as something that sets the condition of possibility for communication, as that which precisely makes communication and everything, all the complications around communication possible. And one of the things that's always played enormous influence in my thinking about translation is this fantastic essay by Roman Jakobson, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And I think he wrote it in the 40s or maybe in the 50s. It's called Translation from a Linguistic Point of View or something like that. Anyway, it's widely anthologized, and people can find it in lots of different places. But he said something that made a deep impression on me, which is, he said we could think of translation in three ways. One, it is an interlingual act, and it's always an act, right? It's never just a concept, it's always an act. So it's interlingual, so between languages. The second thing he said is it's also intralingual, which means the translation takes place within the same language, right? And that makes that explodes the whole notion of monolingualism, to the extent that you have to translate within the same language, means that every language contains a heterogeneous element within itself, that every language requires translation within itself. And perhaps the best proof of this is the dictionary, right? You look at a dictionary and it's language translating itself into the same language, but different. And the third thing he said was that translation also entails intersemiotic sort of movement. So there's an intersemiotic aspect to translation, which means that the moment you move from one medium to another, you're already translating. Even within the same medium, you're already translating. And that to me suggested a pretty expansive view of translation. If it is interlingual, if it is intralingual, and if it's intersemiotic, then what isn't translation, right? The question of translation seems to encompass all aspects of life. And that's possible because there is also an aspect of untranslatability to every act of translation. Untranslatability means that there are parts of language, or there are parts of every semiotic activity that resists translation, but that this resistance to translation, this notion of untranslatability, as many people have written about, is in fact an incitement to further translation. It is a guarantee that every translation will fail, and because it will fail, it will require more translation, right? Hence, the cliche, there's no perfect translation. Every translation is an approximation, the whole conflict between fidelity and accuracy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So built into the notion of translatability is untranslatability, which guarantees conflict, and which guarantees a measure of incoherence to every act of translation. This suggested to me precisely the essence of communicative struggle. With translation, you have communicative struggle, right? Because then you introduce the question of decision. If translation is always so imperfect, who decides? Who decides what is adequate translation? Who decides which translation will satisfy which context at what point in time for whose particular audiences, for which particular interlocutors, right? So the question of decision, of course, introduces two other things, which is ethics, right? Because decision always brings up the question of ethics. And secondly, politics, right? Who has the power? Who has the right? Who is the sovereign that decides which translation will live and which translation will die, right? And so that brings up the question that I think constitutes so many aspects of life, right? It's the question of coherence, communication, of ethics, of politics, and of course, of power. And this brings up one of the things that I've always been fascinated with translation, which has always animated everything I've done, which is that translation is not simply an act. It is also, and precisely because it is an act, it is an inconclusive act, an ongoing act that has no guarantees of succeeding. If anything, that always points to the permanent possibility of failure and therefore having to start all over again. This seems to me that translation is a deeply existential act, right? And it's the existential quality of translation that's always fascinated me. That it's not just about literary texts, or it's not just about translating, say, for the movies or the novels or whatever, but it is something that happens on the basis of everyday existence, everyday life, right? Everyday life is shaped precisely by the predicaments of translation. And in this case, it's very interesting to read a couple. I just want to quote a couple of things that I think speaks to this. I've been reading some James Baldwin recently for a separate thing I'm doing, and I was quite surprised how much Baldwin talks about language. And he's probably one of the most underrated and overlooked theorists of language in the United States or in the world. And let me just read two passages from something he wrote many years ago. He says, what joins all languages and all men is the necessity to confront life in order, not inconceivably, to outwit death, right? So for Baldwin, the question of life and death was always present in the question of language, because he always felt, as a Black man in America, he always felt that whatever language he spoke was not his language, but always somebody else's, and that he had to struggle in order to appropriate, to make claims on that language, to make it his own, to make it reflect his experience. And here's another passage that I think highlights precisely the riskiness of language for Baldwin. He says, language is a political instrument, means, and proof of power. There have been and are times and places when to speak a certain language could be dangerous even fatal. Or one may speak the same language, but in such a way that one's antecedents are revealed or one hopes hidden. To open your mouth, if I may use Black English, is to put your business in the street. You have confessed your parents, your youth, your school, your salary, your self-esteem, and alas, your future. Right, which in turn brings to mind this really sort of very sort of instructive quote from Frantz Fanon in another context. He's talking about French, where he says to speak means to be in a position to use a certain syntax to grasp the morphology of this or that language, but it means above all to assume a culture, to support the weight of a civilization, to support the weight of a civilization. Now, this is the task, as it were, of every translator, to the extent that a translation entails, as I said, the intralinguistic, the interlinguistic, and the intersymbiotic. It is always life and death. And everywhere you look today, that seems to be the case, whether it's a question of immigration or a question of refugees, where precisely different languages are at play, and the problem of seeking relief by being able to address the state, by being able to address sources of social welfare, the police, and so forth. These are all at play. You turn the papers, you read about a situation in Afghanistan where Afghan translators are right now in the process of trying to find relief from the prospect of being killed by the Taliban for their translation work with Western forces. And again, I mean, I think Babli pointed this out, the way in which a translation creates linguistic hierarchies between standard languages and vernaculars and mother tongues, and how there's always constant debate, constant conflict as to which language to privilege in which context and so forth. Antonia points this out, the problem of sort of how do you deal with indigenous languages with very few speakers, when you don't even speak that language, right? So all of these, I think, seem to me to give shape to this notion of translation as life, which, of course, the flip side of this is translation could be death, right? So those are the things I wanted to say.
Thank you so much, Vicente, because that was a point that I was really hoping would come up during this two-day webinar, the situation of the Afghan translators working in Afghanistan, for whom language, as you pointed out in the second quote, can sometimes actually be death. Translation is not necessarily life. It sometimes leads directly to death. I don't think it's the only historical occurrence we've had of translators actually being held politically responsible for what they do, but that's another very interesting area as well, and that is the very overtly political nature of some types of translation. Perhaps all types of translation in the end are, in a sense, either implicitly or overtly political to some extent. I was just wondering what Antonia and Babli think about, especially this notion of, you gave the title of life in your conversation, but to a certain extent, there seems to be a lot of negativity and a lot of danger and death as well in the areas that you've pointed out. Black Lives Matter, the nature of minorities in the South, etc. So I don't know that the term life can actually, as Vicente just said, actually be taken by itself without also coupling it with the notion of death as well, unfortunately, in the contemporary world, and perhaps also in the history of translation as well. I was just wondering what your thoughts might have been on that.
Okay, so now real quick, bring back that, because I realized that I left that very important part, which is why life is in my radar in translation, and it is because in this process of the left that I mentioned before, with all these leftist dictators in the region, they appropriated an indigenous concept for governance, which is sumac causae, and they translated it into Spanish as in buen vivir, right? So it's like living well instead of better than others, So, but then it's like how you appropriate and dispossess meaning right? And so you put an indigenous shirt, you go on TV, you make everything colorful, and you put a Quechua slogan to your campaign. But in fact, the concept of life, the summa causa as a concept, started spreading across the region. And it reached, for example, the Zapatistas, who are now traversing Europe in their expedition for life and against the death of neoliberalism, right? And so they are unveiling the other Europe to the world, and all these people who are living under the oppression of neoliberalism within Europe itself. It's very interesting who they are meeting, right? Because it's not just anarchist groups. It is all kinds of people in all kinds of places. You should really check that out. But this idea of life in the Amazon and life in the planet, right now it's politicized. But there is a real translation on what we mean by summa causa, by having the political right to have a good life, you know, and what that entails. And it doesn't matter what front you take this problem, translation is at the center of it. Because at the center of it is the fact that someone else has a life that and you have another, right? All language is always is translation, right? Like this possibility of heterogeneity within monolingualism that Vince was pointing is one example, but also, you know, the Benjaminian aspect of when we translate medieval text, are we translating it for the living or for the dead, you know? Or is the text changed when we are when we are giving it life and making it translated in many various languages accessible on the internet in a multilingual edition? You know what I mean? Many things can happen existentially, let's say, with translation, and you cannot escape translation when you are dealing with life. And yes, sometimes you have to think about it in terms of death, but people here prefer to think about it in terms of life, and as a renouncement of death, as neoliberalism and capitalism as a model of death.
Fascinating. Babli, your take on all of this? You'll have to turn your microphone on, sorry.
Thank you. Thank you for bringing me in. You know, there's no point of disagreement with either Vicente or Antonia on this. I would just want to give another kind of, sort of reading here. Western democracies predicated on freedom of expression. In Cyprus, there was a very interesting conference I attended, and this scholar from Italy, I forget the name, but we can always, he was talking to us about how Dante's Inferno, with its depiction, or rather, of the Prophet of Islam, would no longer be possible in contemporary society. And so for me, that made a very interesting connection with freedom of expression, knowledge as a zone of danger, knowledge itself as a zone of danger. And we can think of Copernicus, we can think of Giordano Bruno, we can think of so many, just knowledge being dangerous, and dangerous to the structures of power. So they connect very well. And the case of the Afghan translators, of course, shows up in a very stark and naked way how life itself can be endangered by the knowledge of just languages and association with them. So I think that there are questions of geopolitics was something that was raised yesterday's conversation. I think it's extremely important to see or to think through this concept, and I hope the school is able to do it in some form or the other, that what does translation mean? What is it to be a translator? And it is not just, as has been said, just a skill or a praxis. It's a whole way of it's a worldview, it's politics, it's economics, look, what book gets translated? I've been a translator into Italian. What gets picked up for translation into another European language from an Indian language? First, its existence in translation as an English text. And English translation is assessed by the publishing house. And then it is said, okay, now we can translate Mahashweta Devi's such and such work. It's been done by Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak into English, and therefore, it merits a translation into Italian. And that's how I worked with a collaborator. But what I'm trying to say is that so many, coordinates intersect, even in the very skill of praxis of translation and the skill of translation, and what gets picked up for translation and what does not. So that what does not get picked up is excluded from a whole canon, from a whole corpus. This is a very interesting interplay that takes place when in creation of canons itself. I mean, we know about it. So that applies equally to translation and what works to translate, who translates, etc. So I think that knowledge is connected with danger. It always is dangerous. And that is why the state, the first thing that state does when it takes over in a conflict situation is kill the intellectuals, kill the repositories of knowledge, or destroy repositories of culture and knowledge. I mean, we see this again and again and again in our own lives, in our own contemporary histories. That's what I would like to, I agree with what is being said. And I just wanted to add this also, that knowledge is always dangerous. It's not just a translation.
I think Juliana has a question that came to her via Siri, if I'm not mistaken. So Juliana, if you'd like to join us and ask Siri's question on her behalf, please.
Of course I can. Here I am. Hello. Siri was asking specifically and quite generally, going back to the role, the important role of orality and sound in certain culture, how can this role change translation studies in general?
May I respond?
Yes, please.
Of course.
Juliana, I just want to refer to to some work, actually, the praxis of it. What we did in our Translation and Translation Studies Center in the college itself is ask speakers of that language which didn't have a script, just an oral language without a script, to Romanize the sound to the extent possible in one of the languages, Hindi or English, and see if we could approximate the flow of the spoken word of that original source language. And we were able to bring out a volume of work, a student's journal. Actually, we work with students in the center. Students worked on this kind of translation, tales that they've heard from their grandmothers, songs that they have heard in their own little tribal communities, and then romanized them or used them in the Hindi to invoke the sound of that language. That was the only way I could see some breakthrough was made in hearing that language and knowing and using a parallel text, so that the meaning of that text was immediately evident to the reader. So it all moves through different media. I think that new media might find more solutions. I'm not a technical, I'm not well versed in technology of the new media, but I think I intuitively I feel that it offers the possibility of translation of oral languages into into sort of a globally comprehensible idiom. And that, I think, would be a huge leap for translation studies in any case, because language does not exist in a vacuum. It's always a key to culture. It's always a key to comprehending another group, another community, another language, sort of another world. Let's put it that way. So I think that that was one of the discoveries of putting this kind of thing into practice. But I don't know, others may have, my colleagues on the panel may have other views on it and other modes of apprehending this kind of, significance of of translating orality.
There is a comment on the Q&A line, and it's by Joanna Huss. And she says, on the topic of the heterogeneous notion of language and Baldwin, I'm reading with my son Baldwin's Little Man, which is a children's book for adults. Written in Black vernacular, it is a love song and a celebration of a Black urban experience of childhood that refuses to be translated into inverted commas standard English, as Black English is essential to the experience and the telling of the experience. Part of that experience includes death at the hands of the police and constant presence of police surveillance. I wholeheartedly agree with Vicente that Baldwin is a revolutionary thinker about language and one from whom translation studies can benefit. Perhaps this could spur us to consider another NIDA conversation, translation studies, learning from Baldwin. This is a and
Certainly.
I don't know whether you want to comment.
Yeah, no, there's a very interesting, Baldwin is a very interesting short essay called How I Learned to Stop Hating Shakespeare. And a lot of it had to do with his ability to be able to realize that he wasn't simply having to submit to the particularities of English, certainly imperial English that you have in Shakespeare, but he realized that he could also, as it were, enter into it as if it was his own language. It's a whole question of appropriation. He was appropriation he was very interested in. And it's also interesting, and I don't know enough about this, that he spent the last years of his life living in France. And I think that part of the reason is because he just wanted a place where there was something other than English that he could negotiate with, that he could deal with. But certainly, I mean, as a writer, his communicative struggles, as it were, were constantly ongoing. So, yeah, and I think this is the situation with every writer, especially colonial and post-colonial writers, who seek to struggle with languages that are inheritances, as it were, legacies from another colonial order. As you know, which is another way of thinking about translation as something that is primary rather than secondary, right? The historical situatedness of the writer, of the thinker, of the speaker will always sort of foreground the question of translation. And I think Baldwin is one of the more eloquent, and Fanon as well. I think they're two of the most eloquent speakers of that. Toni Morrison has lots of interesting things to say about language and translation as well. So, yeah.
And thank you. And there is a question by Christy Merrill, and she says, I'd like to hear Vicente say more about the quotation from James Baldwin he's been working on, and how we might understand that through the stereotypes Antonia mentioned that shapes what I understand her to be thinking about in terms of the archive, which is relevant to us all. I think the line he was quoting might be followed by Baldwin on the price, inverted comma, of outwitting death. What joins all languages and all men is the necessity to confront life in order, not inconceivably, to outwit death. The
Yeah.
price for this is the acceptance and achievement of one's temporal identity. This is what Christine Merrill writes.
Oh, I should have included that last part. Thank you, Christine, for mentioning that. Yeah, yeah. It's as I said, this really struck me as a way of thinking about the existential condition of translatability, right? That without translation, there would be no communication. But at the same time, that communication itself is no guarantee. It's no guarantee. No guarantee of life. Or it could because it could result in a different kind of life, a life that is in some ways worse than the one we're experiencing, or it could result in death. I mean, think of, for example, confronting the police, addressing the police one way and then being addressed another, with terribly tragic results. So it's very difficult. So let me just stop there, and maybe we can talk about other things.
Yeah, I think that what Vince is saying is very important. It's like but colonialism is not something that happened. It's not that the British showed up with boats and now we are here. It's something that happens. And it happens in the way you speak. And that quote of like revealing your parents, it really hit a chord with my research, because that's what intralingual Spanish is, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's like trying to sound not indigenous, trying to sound not Black, trying to sound not peasant. And the greatest writers have exploded and exploited that in their favor. Some in their own flesh, like Mariátegui, who constantly live in indigenous Spanish and had to face the Spanish of the city. And as long as there's migration and there is language, there's translation. And without migration, we all die. Movement is what keeps us alive. It is also, I wanted to comment on that previous question about orality. When the internet hit, I knew that we were at the times of Luther. When the printing press came, it was something totally new, and it took centuries for it to get to the Enlightenment letters that have shaped all our scholarship ever since, right? So I do think orality is the preferred means by which this new media connects, not so much as literacy. But I do want to say that this generation reads more characters per minute than any generation in human history, right? So there is a presence of writing, but the sustained rhetoric of this new media is oral. And it is very interesting because it opens up the door for many people to produce knowledge. And for example, with the prisoners, many of them don't know how to read and write. And this is the case for many people in places where our languages are written, right? And so it opens up new ways to, for example, the voice note, little videos, the plasticity. Well, not in the sense that, maybe yes, in the sense that Caroline spoke of yesterday, right? So it's a transmedial experience at all times, and translation is at the center of that. And it does open the possibility to fight for meanings of life that are not necessarily dominated, even though the algorithms are dominated by Google, but not always dominated by English and Spanish and Portuguese and German and French.
Okay.
I really hate to interrupt this conversation at this point, but we're about to start our break before the next session. I'd like to thank Vicente, Babli, Antonia, and obviously Juliana as well for a fascinating conversation. I'm sure that there will be more questions on this topic during the plenary session later on this evening. I will see you all later then.